Howdy, folks. This is the long-promised pilot episode of Living in Theria. Now, for those of you who don't know, I used to write a little article on the website called, you guessed it, Living in Theria. Each week I would kind of take a person, place, or thing in our little world and kind of expound upon it and give you a little insight into how it came to be, its backstory, its history, stuff that doesn't exactly come up on the show necessarily, but a lot of you guys have questions about, or we'll send in a random email about something like that. So for the pilot episode, I figured we can talk about the White Ravens, which is a subject that's kind of near and dear to my heart. So without further ado, let's get started. So to start, before they were even called the White Ravens, Trey Straverson, who was originally played by Jeremy Alonso on the show, left the Overwatch after over a decade of service as captain of the guard there. He just became increasingly dissatisfied with how militaristic the city had gotten, how once they protected and kind of locked down their city to make sure that no outside threat would harm them, that they started worrying more and more about within. Carter had gotten increasingly paranoid after Group 1 left and just didn't come back. And the direction the city was taking was just something that Treyas didn't agree with anymore, and he ended up leaving. Liara, who was his second in command, decided to stay, and she briefly took over as captain of the guard, although very reluctantly. She's not one to take charge. She's more of kind of a backup. She doesn't like to be in the spotlight too much. Treyas, as kind of paying a penance, decided to start the Ravens as an opposition to specifically what the Overwatch was doing in the Evergreen at the time, which was completely displacing the Elven population. They had already, many years ago, cleared out any encampments or small villages that had been there. The original, they called it the Purge, which was the original exiling of anybody who lived on the outskirts of the city within that sphere of influence, but weren't actually within the walls of the city. A lot of farmers were displaced this way. A lot of logging camps. Brianna and her father actually lived in one of them, and they were kind of forced to leave. A lot of people either went east or fled north. So Treyas, as a way to kind of make up for that, kind of formed this very small militia. And a lot of it was just, it's a very Robin Hood type of feel, robbing for the rich to give to the poor, because the encampments that the Overwatch were setting up were flush with food and water and rations, whereas a lot of these displaced people didn't have any of that, and it was very hard for them to get by. Now, as a secondary measure, they were also clear-cutting bits of the Evergreen to firstly make way for their encampments that they were setting up, and secondly to take the wood as building materials for more Warforged. That's very much fueling what the Overwatch was trying to do. So this very small militia was set up, and they would kind of make these little guerrilla attacks to attack these encampments and take food and water and rations and weapons and whatever they can get their hands on. And that's kind of how the Ravens got started. Now, a lot of these early White Ravens members weren't fighters. So again, they had to rely on a lot of guerrilla tactics, a lot of like get in, get out, hit hard, hit fast, attack at night, try to attack only when there's a few people on guard duty, try to, limit the exposure of what could turn into a fight, like get out as quickly as possible so they would limit their losses. Now, the more they did this, the better weapons they got, the more food they got, the more, and word quickly spread about this small guerrilla movement that was taking place in the Evergreen. And as word spread, more and more people started to get on board. So this little unit started to kind of grow and swell. They ended up making their home in this network of caves, which was incredibly well hidden. Unless you were specifically looking for it and knew exactly where it was you're 99% sure to just walk on by, unless you're randomly exploring or had some reason to be in that specific area. 9 times out of 10, you would just walk on by. There'd be no reason to check it out. So these new people started to come in, and with new people came new skills. So there were a few ex-military or someone who could help train new soldiers. Traius was the one who originally took the initiative, and he had tons of military training by that time as captain of the guard in the Overwatch, and he would teach people how to defend themselves at the very least. It really wasn't about attacking defenseless people. It was more about attacking Warforged encampments, so they didn't feel too badly about, hurting Warforged. They try to avoid hurting people as often as they could. Now, on top of fighters, they also got people who were excellent spies, or someone who would be an excellent scout. Spies were a little more limited, as that requires a degree of acting talent. You have to be able to get into some place and pass yourself off as a member of the Overwatch, or someone who would be able to lay low and not you wouldn't think that person would be a member of the Ravens, obviously, or someone who would be a threat. The scouts came in handy very often, as the longer they were in the forest, the larger this force got, the more they needed a way to communicate back and forth, because people would be out for days at a time if they were keeping an eye on a location or a camp or a specific troop movement, something like that. They would need a way to not only stay hidden, but to communicate back and forth. So one of Traius's hobbies in the city, when he lived in the Overwatch, were to train birds to carry messages throughout the city. Now, they had a mailing system, and it wasn't incredibly necessary, but it was something that kind of alleviated stress for him. So that is a little skill he took and taught the Ravens how to do that. Again, this was before they had a name. Now, the White Raven is kind of a rarity in Theria, but they are kind of plentiful in that specific section of the Evergreen. So capturing a few of them and kind of teaching them a route to go back and forth and to carry messages was something he worked on. So it kind of became this little beacon of hope for a scout to see a White Raven kind of fly towards them and deliver some much needed encouragement or a message, or and vice versa. If they were waiting on word to see if someone were moving, or someone were a specific stash were unguarded, it became really encouraging to see these birds kind of fly in and give these messages out, so that they would know to avoid a specific area or to attack a specific area, and they knew that there'd be little or no resistance there. So after about a year, Liara decided to leave the Overwatch for the same reasons that Traius did, but she was exposed to a bit more of it now being in charge. She was fed up with leading it and fed up with people seeing her as a threat. She used to get a sense, kind of going through the city, that she was helping to protect people, that she was helping to keep things safe, and instead it kind of became this thing where people would look at her out of the corner of their eye, or be fearful when she walked through a room, because people didn't want to be hung, and that was something that was happening a lot in the Overwatch at the time, and still kind of happens to this day. If people suspect you of something and they have the tiniest shred of proof, you will be hung. It is something that will happen, because they would rather snuff out a potential threat in a hurry than deal with the ramifications of someone really doing any damage. So that is something she got fed up with. She ended up joining Traius, and the two of them made quite a good team, actually. Liara tends to be a little more ruthless with specific things. So she definitely had a hand in training the ravens in ranged combat, and specifically with a crossbow. She would teach them how to target vital organs, or to really hit hard, get in, get out. And she had very little qualms with attacking people, whereas Traius would avoid that at all costs. There are certain situations where it was a lot easier to just send in Liara, because she would not have a problem doing that. She saw them as the enemy, and she would do what she needed to do to get rid of them. So about 3 years before our current story right now, as of episode 60, Traius and Liara happened upon a homeless young woman named Brianna, who was malnourished and apparently abused. She wouldn't tell them anything about herself or where she came from, other than to say that she lived in Winter Haven until recently, and she had left. Wouldn't tell them why, wouldn't go into any detail beyond that. Traius kind of saw something in her instantly, and wanted to take her in, wanted to teach her how to defend herself, wanted to kind of give this young lady a leg up. Liara didn't like her at first. She found her to be mouthy and stubborn and pig-headed, and much more prone to act out, and kind of much more prone to speak and lash out than she would be to just listen and follow directions. And that's something that Liara did not take a shine to, and it took a while for her to warm up to Brianna. After a while, though, Traius kind of kept working with Liara, kept give her a chance. She's young. She'll pick stuff up, and slowly but surely, the two of them kind of bonded. And eventually, the three of them became something kind of close to a family, with Traius and Liara being a little older, and Brianna only being 22 at the time. So they kind of took this young lady under their wing, and eventually they found out that she was a scion. After many sleepless nights, and there was a situation where they took her out on a field mission, along with some other ravens to kind of help gather food, and that she ended up using her powers, and she kind of trusted them enough to let them know that was what she was, and they could definitely use that kind of power with the White Ravens, even though it kind of flies in the face of everything they do. Scion powers are not stealthy in the least. They're loud and bright, and they attract a lot of attention, cause a lot of destruction. So Traius tried to help work with her, and Liara did too eventually, and try to kind of curb some of that impact. The sad thing is that, unlike someone like Dagon, Brianna's powers are much more based on emotion. That's where she draws her power from. Dagon's is much more discipline. So while Dagon has much more control over his powers and will live a lot longer than Brianna, she's just much more powerful than Dagon in a lot of respects, because she can let loose and really tap into her emotions. Dagon, being a Ladrin, kind of channels that, kind of keeps it focused. So eventually, like I said, they kind of became this little family, like this little trio, kind of sitting at the top of the Ravens, and the Ravens continued to expand, and eventually they numbered in the hundreds. 300, 400, 500, and they would kind of spread throughout the forest, and they would try and lock down points, try and sabotage clear-cutting operations, try and help. That they kind of established this rapport with the elves, where the elves were losing ground in the Evergreen because the elves by nature are slightly pacifists. They don't want to fight, but they're watching their home get chopped down foot by foot every day. So A big problem were the Titans. Once the Titans started moving into the Evergreen, it was very difficult to repel them. They're huge, they're armored, they're vicious killing machines if they want to be. They're designed to chop down trees, but they will cut through people pretty quickly. So the three of them kind of put their heads together and were quite a formidable team, actually. Liara's precision, Treyas's military mind, and Brianna's brute power kind of formed this really neat little military unit. So things kind of continued on for almost another year. And one day, the three of them and almost 24 ravens were investigating this quarry. It was said that there was a fairly loosely guarded encampment there that had enough food and water and supplies to last them quite a bit. And that was something they kind of needed to capitalize on, because at the time they were running very low. It had been very lean for a few months, and they really didn't have much of a choice but to kind of go after it. Now, it was never decided whether the intel they got was purposely misleading or just poorly gathered. But this low rocky quarry was a fantastic ambush spot, it turned out, because if you were to place 2 or 3 dozen Warforged at the top and just fire down into it, it turns out you can kill many ravens very quickly. Liara and about half a dozen of the ravens managed to escape. Many were cut down instantly. Treyas ended up using his own body to shield Brianna, and caught several arrows in the back as a result. He kind of fell on top of her, which, while protecting her and making sure that she wouldn't be caught in the hail of arrows that kind of fell upon them, it did have the unfortunate side effect of trapping her between the quarry rocks and Treyas's body, and she was trapped there for almost an hour while she could hear these Warforged kind of move around, and eventually they left, and she managed to kind of wriggle herself out from under Treyas's body. She met up with the rest of the ravens again, and there was a period of grieving, a period of mourning. They had no leader. The only leader the ravens had ever known was dead. And it left quite a hole, because Treyas had a pretty precise military mind. He was level-headed. He had a clear conscience about what they were trying to do, and he was kind of the cornerstone of this organization and what they were doing. And Liara didn't want to take the helm, even though she was the natural next choice. Everyone kind of knew it. They looked to her. And Liara suggested Brianna, which was not a popular decision because of her youth and inexperience and temper. She kind of promised that she would work with her and stay on as second in command, and the two of them would kind of run the ravens together, with Brianna being at the top. Brianna herself was reluctant to take the position, and she saw it as her trying to replace Treyas, who had kind of been something of a father figure to her. And she fought it, but Liara kind of kept pushing at it, and kind of based on the crux of they need her. People to look to her, just based on power, just based on what she could bring to the table and Liara's knowledge. And ever since then, Brianna has tried to live up to what Treyas had left behind, which is insanely difficult when you think about it, because when someone leaves that big a hole, it's very tough to try and step into their shoes and constantly question yourself and say, what would that person have done if they were in this situation? And the bleaker things have gotten, especially recently on the show, again, we're up to episode 60 at the time, and we are getting ready for the greater good, the harder it's been to do exactly that. So that pretty much brings us up to present time. So, each week on Living in Theria, what I would like to do is, if this takes off, if you guys like it, I'm going to go by views and comments and that kind of thing. If you guys like it, and ask questions and in the comment section under the YouTube video, I'd appreciate it, because I'm going to take your questions and I am going to answer them in each video depending on what topic we're going to do. I'll also take topic suggestions too. If you have one that you're really curious about, then I'll do a Living in Theory on that. This one is from Jordan Cook. What, if any, are the goals of the White Ravens beyond death to the king? Death to the king isn't specifically a White Raven goal. It's more of them asking themselves, how can we put a stop to this? And killing Carter isn't necessarily going to do that. It's going to create a power vacuum, and then someone else will step up. Now, recently, with them being constantly attacked in the Evergreen, which is their home, alongside the elves, their main goal at the moment is to protect their home and try and drive out the Overwatch threat there. A secondary goal right now would be to help defend Winter Haven and just repel the Overwatch back into their own walls if they can. Beyond that, that's something that they would probably discuss with the groups, and because they're not really looking to sack anybody's home, because there are a lot of innocent people living in the Overwatch. At the same time, they're not going to stop. They're going to keep trying to expand. That's kind of what the Overwatch is all about. They want, well, Carter wants to take over Theria and remake it in his image to keep people safe as far as he's concerned. Let's see here. Carol Coet. Why in 17 years did the White Ravens never find themselves another group of adventurers to play the hero? I mean, did they have some completely different game plan before Group 1 showed up? Heroes, quote-unquote, are rare. Adventuring groups in most D&D campaigns are plentiful when you think about it. They're all over. A lot of people in Theria are just struggling to get by, especially on the West Coast. On the East Coast, people are concerned with kind of money and power. If you look at a city like Brightport would not exist on the West Coast, because the West Coast is pretty much about military. You have places like Winter Haven, which is pretty much all about defense, just wall up, keep yourself safe. That's their game plan. Then you have like Thunderspire, which is a little more territorial, a little more. They will be militaristic if you encroach on their territory, what they perceive to be their territory. And then you have the Overwatch, who is constantly expanding like a virus and will keep cutting down and taking, and they'll drive out. You can see what they did with Durnhollow. Very opportunistic. They will take any opportunity they can to move forward, to get a foothold, to keep pushing. So heroes are rare. That's not someone who would sacrifice selflessly, someone who would put their neck on the line and not expect payment. That is incredibly rare in Theria. That is not something that happens all the time. That's not. Everyone has an agenda. Everyone has some kind of end game normally. So as much as we kind of make fun of Group 1 for how they're doing it, the reasoning behind it is sound, or at least logical. That the way they do it isn't always necessarily the cleanest, but yeah, the same would go for Group 3. Some would say Group 3 is paying a penance for, much like Treyas was, for probably some really awful, horrible things that they've done for the city, and they're trying to make good. So we're going to see how that goes. Let's see here. Austin Chadwin, how can I join? Are there other White Raven camps around Theria? And how are they viewed by people? How well known are they? They mostly exist on the west coast. There are a few ravens positioned in towns. There were a few that were lucky enough to get into the Overwatch themselves and kind of implant themselves. As we found out recently, very high up, as it turns out. They've done a very good job at what they do. They're not really a military group. They're about, you know, spying and scouting. That's what they do best because they have to. They're not a large group. They're not. They can't overpower someone normally. They aren't about brute force. So that's what they do. Joining the White Ravens can be difficult because first you have to find them, and then once you do, trust is something that's hard to earn in Theria. It can be. If you take a look at Group 3, you can kind of see how they charted it. And it took Brianna trying to murder Una, and she kind of felt bad about that eventually, but without Liara kind of pulling her aside, she might have tried again. You never know. So after that, it took a little bit for them to earn some trust, and you kind of get a sense for someone, I think. Whether, not to mention that Group 3 didn't really have any choice after defecting. They had nowhere to go, so that kind of took some of the edge off. Once they figured out, it's like, okay, well, you're screwed. You don't have anywhere to go. Would you have a reason to fight for us? And if so, why? Why would we trust you? Why would we? And it turns out that those particular 3 members of Group 3 have good hearts deep down. It's just, again, maybe like Group 1, the way they go about things isn't always the best. So the bottom line, I guess, is that earning someone's trust is kind of all about whether they can kind of lean on you and they think that they are going to get some support. Now, if you look at a situation like Rodswell, that is exactly why that caught Group 1 off guard so much. He'd been there for a long time. Maybe not in-game, but outside of game. Dan played Rodswell for a very long time, and like, he's constantly there as a healer. He was there to resurrect eventually if they needed it, and one day he just walks out. And then you find out he's on the other side. So that's if you're there to defend somebody's life, you expect them to have your back. And when kind of that trust evaporates, you have a real problem. Paul Bennett, the White Ravens are not freedom fighters, as they do not operate to liberate Overwatch. This makes them terrorists. Discuss. On the Overwatch side, they would absolutely be labeled as terrorists. They have been labeled as terrorists on the show because what do terrorists do? That whole guerrilla mentality, the knocking over encampments, the stealing, that would make them terrorists. But again, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Whether they don't directly operate to liberate the Overwatch, the only reason that's not one of their goals initially is because they don't have the force to do it. They couldn't knock over the city walls and run in. Like, this is, even with the force that Group 1 is gathering, that's a long shot. To get there, they're going to have to cross a lot of territory and fight through a lot of Warforged and human soldiers alike, siege weapons, and a fully functional, defendable city. That is a lofty goal. Just because that's a pie-in-the-sky dream. That's not because they don't want to do it, it's because it's out of their grasp physically. What victories have the Ravens achieved? That is from Paul Bennett. Very minor ones. The biggest victory that they would have achieved would be the Titan Elite, helping to defend Kalkas, which is a monumental achievement for the elves. Brianna was there to help, and being a Raven, that kind of falls under their jurisdiction too. Now, Group 1 helped massively, and they had Elven backup, obviously, so that was kind of a group victory. But that would be the largest thing that you can attribute to the Ravens, as they mostly knocking over encampments, you know, falling a Titan every once in a while. Just those would be considered minor. by like group 1, group 3 standards. You know, killing a dragon, killing a Titan elite, killing Drakh, things like that. But to them, to a small, not military force, to knock over something like that, that's pretty monumental. So I think that's going to wrap it up for this particular episode. If you have any questions about a person, place, or thing in Theria, want me to do a Living in Theria on it, pop it in the comments below. If you have, once we have the next topic, I'll post on the fan page on Facebook, and you can ask questions there about that person, place, or thing, or just, again, pop it in the comments on YouTube. Let us know what you think of this, so I'll know whether to make more or to just kind of scrap it and do something else. So I hope you enjoy this, and I will see you on the next episode if there is one. Thank you for watching.